Okay, well, thank you everyone for joining today. Today's session is the first in our four-part workshop series all about connecting with industry. And today we'll really set the scene for everything that we'll be talking about in the coming weeks. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm Abby Schnell. I'm a licensing associate with UIRF. I've been here for about coming up on 4 years now. I work mainly with technologies in the biomedical area, so a lot of therapeutics, some medical devices, more recently, research tools. My background is in pharmacology and physiology, and while I was a grad student, I got involved in a business consulting group where I worked with startups, investment firms, and some small and mid-sized companies. So throughout this presentation, I may share a few insights from that experience, but I'll mostly be leaning on my experience with UIRF and the perspective that we get interacting with industry and business development professionals. Here we go. So, before we dive in, I just want to show how this session fits into the larger series. So today we'll be talking about how industry thinks about problems and opportunities. Next week, we'll get into storytelling and communicating your research in a way that really resonates with industry audiences. Then we'll discuss networking with industry and outreach, and then navigating different types of industry partnerships. So you don't need to attend all four sessions to find this one useful, but they are designed to build upon each other. And this is really the first time that we're running this sort of workshop. We developed it with kind of researchers' interests in mind. We've been seeing more of a desire for researchers to engage with industry, and I think it's particularly relevant in the context of the current funding climate. That being said, UIRF were very happy to talk with researchers and visit colleges and departments, and we're definitely open to tailoring the materials that we present to everyone. So it'll be great to get some feedback after this workshop series about what landed well, what was helpful, what you might want to hear more about in the future. Okay, so I really want to take a moment to kind of ground this workshop in what UIRF does and why what we do really qualifies us in speaking on these topics. So UIRF is really a bridge between academia and industry. Researchers are the ones who are, doing the research, generating new knowledge and technologies, whereas industry is focused on developing products, as well as manufacturing them, scaling them, really bringing them to market. So our office's role is to connect these two worlds. And you can see on the slide here our commercialization process. If you've attended one of our talks before, you may be familiar with this figure. It really begins with the researchers doing the research, coming up with new ideas that may have commercial potential, and then disclosing those innovations to our office. And then our office is responsible for evaluating new technologies, protecting intellectual property, and then finding industry partners. And these activities are really critical to our mission. As the Tech Transfer Office for the University of Iowa, we take ownership of any intellectual property arising from the university. We invest resources in protecting intellectual property, and so we really try to do our best to find potential licensees. We very frequently interact with companies and business development professionals, as well as some venture groups. We also attend meetings where we talk with other university tech transfer offices and learn what they're doing to identify industry partners, and then we can bring back some of those practices to our own office. So we are constantly, working on new initiatives, new strategies to finding an industry partner and then hopefully negotiating a license agreement. So not all of our technologies are licensed, but for those that are, industry takes on the product development, the manufacturing, and the ultimate commercialization of a product that will go on to reach the market. And I want to take a closer look at the researcher role for a moment. So formally, researchers don't interact with UI or Rev until the disclosure stage. But in practice, there's kind of an informal stage that you can consider the pre-disclosure stage. And this might look like having some early conversations with our office to get feedback on what you're working on. Or it could look like, thinking about the industry perspective early on in your project and then allowing that perspective to shape your project as it evolves. So this isn't a formal requirement that you need to do all this extra work before you disclose to our office. Really, it's not about becoming a business expert or anything. It's more about perspective, thinking about how, an industry perspective can help shape a project as it's developing over time and make that project better, and more likely to succeed and get industry interest. So with that in mind, there are three main goals for today. The first is to highlight how industry evaluates ideas differently than academia. The second is to just be aware that these differences are not necessarily barriers. They're just different viewpoints, and those viewpoints can be navigated. And then the third is to discuss some practical tools that can help you align your research with industry needs. When and if it's, helpful for your project. Maybe it won't be helpful every time you have something that you're working on. But it can be helpful if you're looking to, create something that can be commercialized and you want to get industry interest. So one thing, to understand is that academia and industry are both very focused on innovation, but they have very different priorities when it comes to innovation. They prioritize different things. So in academia, we often emphasize, answering difficult scientific questions, generating new knowledge, and then eventually disseminating that knowledge through publications. Industry is much more focused on, bringing in revenue, growing their business. So they're going to be really cognizant of what the market needs, like the market opportunity of an innovation, what the timelines are to market. They're going to be very aware of the associated risks, and reducing those risks. And they're going to think about scalability and adoption of an innovation. Even if it answers a particular market need, is it going to be adopted widely throughout that market? So one lens isn't really superior to the other. They're just different. And because of these differences, it can cause some like difficulties in communication to arise because people are using different criteria to evaluate new ideas. So a researcher might, you know, have some sort of scientific finding that answers a scientific question that's been plaguing scientists for years. And it's, this really exciting new idea that nobody else in the world knows. But industry might ask, so what? Because they really want to know why it's important, what kind of problem that new idea will solve. And that's not to say that there aren't, industry professionals who are really tuned into the science. I think that there definitely are, and we've definitely met with business development professionals who have scientific backgrounds, who ask really thoughtful questions about the science, and that's important to them too. But I would say in general, the priority is, does it solve an actual problem? Does it meet an unmet need in the market? And then some of these other considerations as well about whether it's a like feasible and viable idea. Okay. So another thing to understand about industry is that it's pretty risk averse. There are several risks that industry is constantly monitoring, and that includes technical risk, market risk, regulatory risk, and commercial risk. Particularly if you have something with clinical applications, regulatory risk is going to be a big concern for industry. Regulatory considerations can play a major role in timelines and feasibility of an innovation. And because of these risks, industry has really changed how they interact with university innovators. Historically, they may have licensed a lot more early stage technologies. And again, this is a generalization, but now kind of what we're seeing is that industry prefers to engage at a later stage. They may want to have a meeting early on, especially if it's something that they're interested in, but it's more to learn about the technology and then kind of monitor the progress. And then they won't engage until the technology has been further developed and de-risked. And that might look like waiting until the technology is in a startup and the startup has developed it further. The company might invest in the startup, they might form some sort of strategic collaboration with the startup, and then if the startup is successful, that company might acquire the startup. So there, are different considerations about that industry model of how they might work with industry innovators. But our office, we have a lot of experience with this. We're constantly monitoring what's happening with industry trends and learning from other universities. And, we're thinking of new approaches. You don't necessarily need to start a startup if you want to get your technology to market. I think that there's definitely some ways where we can support you. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of as you're developing your technology. So with that in mind, we can think about how industry evaluates an idea. They have a lot of different considerations. One is strategic fit. This is something that you can find out even from just a company website. They'll often have information about like the mission and vision of the company. They'll have their product pipeline. So you can get a sense of like what types of markets they're interested in, what types of products they're interested in. For an example, a big pharmaceutical company is going to have a page that lists out all of the disease indications that they're interested in, and then the types of like treatment modalities that they're interested in because they have their own capabilities to develop certain types of projects. So outside of the pharmaceutical industry, other companies will have kind of their own criteria of what's a strategic fit for them. And if something isn't a strategic fit, it's going to probably be an immediate no. And that's not because the idea is a bad idea, it's just because it doesn't fit with what the company's goals are and doesn't align with what the company, like what their value proposition is. So strategic fit is a big one, and it is a big like response that we get from companies often when we're marketing technologies to them. They'll say, "This is not on strategy for us." Sometimes it might just be like a canned response, but other times it is really accurate. Like it just doesn't fit what their capabilities are or what they're looking to accomplish. Return on investment is another big one. Again, for like the biotech types of technologies that require a lot of investment. and time and resources, the looking at the market opportunity is going to be really important. That will inform what the return on investment could be. They're also going to look at things like, costs to manufacture. Are they, and what price they can sell a product for? Will that allow them to get a big enough return on investment that it's worthwhile for them? Um, yes, market opportunity, that there actually is a market need there, that maybe the market is growing, that there isn't too much competition. So then we get into competitive advantage, how, your idea compares to products that are already out there, and then how it compares to innovations that are being developed in parallel as well. Timing is very important. Um, sometimes the market's not ready for a certain type of product, or sometimes you're a little bit too late. So that can be one consideration. And then, of course, stage of development. Like we discussed, industry might not want to engage very early on. So they may, be wanting to know what you've currently done already, what you have planned for the near future, and what progress is going to look like. So I'd like to pause for a second. Oh, Mihaela, did you want to add something?
I was just gonna
Oh,
ask, not ask actually I was gonna add, these are questions that I think are probably interesting as a researcher, or if you're supporting researchers, as you kind of put a new project together, or you're trying to continue the development of that project. But even as you think of finding resources, funding, nowadays, a lot of grants require some sort of commercialization plan, or require, and the more you think about this, the more realistic your plan is going to be. And it's not going to be just something that you fill out on paper, but it's really something that can put you on track to, first to get a plan that's more realistic, but then also if we can be of help to your lab as you draft that grant, or as you're considering, what are the opportunities for what you're developing, it is worth kind of having either these conversations, or you having, like, doing some of this background research, because that's going to increase the odds of success for your technology and yours as a researcher. That's all.
absolutely. Thank you, Mihaela. No, that's a good point. And that's kind of the whole point of this presentation, is like thinking about these things early on can really shape your technology and make it easier for our office to then find an industry partner who's interested. So let's pause here. I have some questions in mind for when you are presenting an idea to industry, what they might ask. But I really would like to hear from you all on what kinds of questions you think that industry might ask when they're evaluating a new technology. So maybe take a second to think about it. Feel free to unmute and suggest a question, or just write it in the chat. And then after we get a few suggestions, I can reveal what questions I came up with. So these can just be really generic questions, or it could even be like examples of questions that you've been asked when presenting a new idea to industry. So it can be from personal experience, or you could just make an educated guess what you think industry might ask. And there's no wrong answers. So feel free to throw anything out there. Maybe a little direction. What's something they could ask when they're trying to figure out what the market opportunity is, or if there is a market opportunity? Any ideas? Or if there's none, that's okay too. You guys are busy eating your lunch. I get it. Okay, so a few ideas that I thought of myself. Um, what problem does this solve? Okay, that's a very generic question, but it's something that, industry will ask in some sort of flavor. What is the actual problem that this idea is solving? Another one, who has that problem, right? Who's experiencing this problem? How many people might be experiencing that problem that can get at, market opportunity. How is it different from other solutions, right? Getting to competitive advantage. What data supports this? So usually in calls with companies, they don't want to see all of your data. They want really high level information, but they do want to know that what you've come up with works. And so, even if it's just like a single experiment, or a few slides, a few figures showing that what you have is, that it works. Maybe if it's that it's safe, if that's important. Um, they want to know that it actually is useful and that it works. And then why now? So getting at the timing, and this could get at like the stage of development too. Both the previous question about what data you already have and then why now. Um, kind of trying to figure out, is this something that we're going to be able to bring to market quickly? Is there a lot more work that needs to be done? Um, UIRF team, can you think of any other questions that come up in these meetings?
Well, related to what data supports this, and this is something that comes up in a lot of our discussions, sometimes this actually is a little more data than the data that is needed for a patent application. We always have these internal conversations. We might be able to file a patent and we might even be able to get a patent, but that might not be sufficient for industry to actually have a full interest in your technology. That's why oftentimes when we interact with faculty, we ask, what kind of grants do you have? What other work are you doing? Because we know maybe industry will take that first call, as Abby said. They'll be like, oh, this is exciting, interesting work. Have you scaled up this technology, or have you done this safety, or have you done this other research, other data that might not necessarily be required for the first step when you interact with us, for instance, like for your disclosure or for a patent application. But oftentimes industry looks for more and more and more information. And as Abby mentioned again, because in companies have removed the risk of doing the early research from their own companies to companies they acquire, they are not willing to kind of take on projects that are underdeveloped or very early. So what data and what more data do you have? I guess the second question is, okay, what else? What else do you have these other data? In subsequent discussions, those questions tend to come up.
Yeah, definitely. And I wouldn't say that you have to have, like, you don't have to predict all of these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Some of this can just be like a conversation. Like, it can provide a lot of information to you about where you're on track and where you might need to do a little bit more, before industry's ready to engage. So I think, thinking about these things beforehand can be really helpful, but then also, you can do that, some of this live as well. Like, if you have a company that's interested in what you're working on, you can, you know, um, get a feel for what they're looking for based on the types of questions that they're asking, and then you can ask some questions yourself as well, to find out, where you might need to, like what directions you might need to go in, to further strengthen your technology.
Yeah, and part of this dialogue, you also have part of the discussions when a company asks, have you done X, which is might be outside the scope of your interest or what your budget project is. That's also an opportunity to see, can industry sponsor research in your lab? Is that kind of side project something that can be done in collaboration with that particular company, to maybe to look at that particular aspect? And we are bringing up, as Abby said, this series to kind of put it on your mind. Just because maybe something is not working out right now, it doesn't mean that it's not something that you could work on, right? Like open the door to a potential collaboration. If they feel that a certain type of data would be beneficial and they like the technology, it's perfectly fine to push to see, okay, if you're interested in this, would you sponsor it? Would you put some money to kind of see how this works? It's again very low risk for companies. Just think about it. If they are to actually have all the equipment, faculty with your level of expertise or researchers, it would cost them a lot more for an equivalent project. So really don't undersell yourself and try to see what are the opportunities to kind of open the door to these collaborations.
Definitely. All right, moving on. So, another thing to think about in terms of industry alignment is the idea of technology push versus market pull. So, technology push starts with a new capability or discovery and then tries to find potential applications for that discovery. Whereas market pull starts with a defined market problem and then tries to come up with solutions or products that solve that problem. Um, Technology push is something we usually see more with university research, and then market pull is more of like an industry perspective. Neither approach is better or worse, they're just different, and they each have their own advantages and limitations. With technology push, you often see more breakthrough technologies or more disruptive technologies, innovations that maybe even create an entirely new market. But then the limitation is that you may lack an immediate market application. You might end up with a technology and you don't exactly know what need it meets. This can create the like solutions in search of a problem. And then market pull, on the other hand, you may end up with a higher likelihood of market relevance and adoption because it's meeting a need that you already defined. The limitation with this approach is that you're not going to get these breakthrough technologies necessarily because you're focusing in on what the customer or the market is demanding, and they're not experts in technological fields, so they don't know the possibilities of what could be created or discovered. So innovate like good innovation probably combines both of these approaches together, and the trick is just really finding the sweet spot. Um, and finding the sweet spot is rarely a linear process. It really can involve a lot of back and forth between some different processes. So it may start with technological development. So that's the research and discovery that you're doing in your lab. If you come up with something you think has commercial potential, maybe you think about, some initial assumptions that you're making around who you think the end user or the customer might be and what problem it might be solving. Then you can do some work validating those unmet needs. And this you can do through several different ways, and we'll address some of those in the next slide. Um, Once you validate unmet needs, then you can go back to your technology and see where it aligns with the market. You can, see there might be some elements that are aligning well, and there might be other elements that need to be refined more. And then you can consider adoption and scale. So what's the real world impact going to be? Is it going to be easy to adopt? Is it going to scale well? And then go back to the drawing board and kind of rework as needed. And you don't need to go through this whole process necessarily. Like maybe you start with technological development, you make it to validating unmet needs, and you realize you need to go back and rework things or take things in a different direction. So it's really just based on, what your technology is, what your process is. And it can, thinking about these things can just help make sure that you're aligned with industry needs early on, and can help your project as it's evolving over time. Okay, and then getting into the different approaches for validating unmet needs. There's several different ways to do this, and this is not an exclusive list, and I apologize. This slide is very text heavy. It's usually not my style, but I'll kind of walk through each of these different approaches. So first is voice of the customer, or VOC. This is an industry term. I really don't like the word customer. I prefer using the term end user because sometimes the person paying for a product isn't the same person that's going to be using it, and that's why I have this next column, stakeholder perspectives, which we'll talk about in a second. But for voice of the customer, this is really, listening to people who are going to be using the product, who are the ones that are experiencing the problem. This is something that I came across a lot as a grad student when I was doing my consulting work. A lot of companies would come to us wanting us to do what we called primary research, and this was going out to end users and interviewing them about, what their workflows were like, what their pain points were like. Maybe we would introduce like a little bit of information about the product in kind of vague terms. The problem with going to an end user and like telling them what your solution is and seeing if they like it is that they probably are going to like it. Like if your innovation is faster, better, cheaper, improved in some way, they're probably going to be all for it. The way to really make sure that what you're developing is aligned with end user needs is to ask more about their pain points and to ensure that what you're coming up with is meeting those. I can't understate the importance of doing this sort of work early on. A lot of the companies that I consulted for found out a lot of information that they wouldn't have been able to find out otherwise, and it allowed them to like pivot to different target markets or go back and kind of think about their product in a different way. So this can be a really useful one. You don't have to talk to a lot of people. Even just a few conversations can be really helpful. Okay, so moving on to stakeholder perspectives. So the reason I included this is because here at the University of Iowa, we have a lot of technologies in the biotech space, therapeutics, medical devices, products where there's going to be a lot of different stakeholders, right? There's the patient, the clinicians, there's the payers, the insurance companies, the hospital administrators who may be making the decision making on purchasing some of these things. And all of those perspectives may differ, and they're all important just to be aware of. You don't necessarily have to go out and talk to all of these people, but just be aware of the pipeline of people that your product is going to need to go through, and know that adoption is going to depend on all of those different perspectives. Next is conferences and talks. So this can be kind of a lower hanging fruit one for a lot of researchers. I think this can be a really great way to hear what people are excited about, what industry is excited about, what challenges are like coming up repeatedly, and then where there may be some unmet needs. Again, this can be a good opportunity to get industry feedback. Like if you give a presentation or even just a poster presentation, you may have some like business development professionals, people from companies come talk to you and ask you about what you're working on. And that can, again, that can be a conversation that you're having with them about what you're working on, what they're looking for, and that can give you some more information. Industry reports. So this is kind of also an easier one, a little bit less work. You can just kind of scan some different industry reports or market research reports. There's a lot of materials out there. You do have access to like the University of Iowa Business Library has a bunch of these resources. IBIS World is one of them where you can look through different industries and you see like there's these long reports of a bunch of different information, like what's driving growth in that industry, what products are having success in that industry, like the different market segmentations. There's a lot of interesting information that those reports can provide, and you don't have to look through a lot of them. Even just like scanning one can give you enough insight to know if your product is going to be a good fit for that industry. And then lastly, discussions with UIRF. So you can have some early discussions with us. We can help you think through your idea, how it might align with industry needs, and kind of like strategies to make sure that it aligns with industry needs, how we might, start marketing early, or like sharing information about your technology early, in a non-confidential way if we need to before we file on any IP. So those early conversations can be really helpful to have and can kind of shape your trajectory and like what other approaches you may use. You don't need to use all of these. You don't need to use any of these. This is really just optional stuff that if you're interested, in making your innovation more appealing to industry, I think they can be, a useful starting place. Um, okay, before we move on, I have a quick poll, just to kind of see, which approach feels like something that would be accessible to you. So if you could please answer the poll, just so that I have a little feedback. Right, you have 10 more seconds to take the poll. I'm gonna end it. Okay, cool. So it's looking like we have stakeholders coming in at number one, which is surprising to me. Conferences and talks, voice of the customer, and then UIRF discussions at number two. Industry reports, nobody chose that one. Okay. Um, does anyone want to let us know why industry reports does not feel accessible to you? Or you can say in the chat, or just say if that's something that would be helpful to learn more about in the future. Like we did a little workshop on like deriving information from industry reports. But okay, that's really helpful, and it makes total sense that people are drawn to different approaches. And I think, as you get more comfortable with this information, maybe you can try out some different approaches too. Okay.
Could I say something real quick on
Oh
industry
yeah,
reports?
absolutely.
I've actually thought about this heavily in that academics are really good at like searching the literature, whether it be
Mhm.
like PubMed, NCBI, all of the locations for which you're going to like read kind of like the bleeding edge or like where your space is at. But the issue is in the like bridge of academia to industry, this is where gaps lie, specifically on like what is the industry trends, like where's the literature on that, and also market trends. It's like Google searching what is the size of my market. You'll have like thousands of articles and reports, and it's like what is trustworthy versus what's been like peer reviewed. You know what I mean? So I feel like
Yeah.
this is something that academics actually should be trained on, who are interested in like this tech transfer process, and we're not necessarily, or at least like have a understanding of like how you guys do that as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, oftentimes, even in our like internal evaluation process, if we're looking for a market size, we'll just Google it, and there's all these market research reports out there that you have to pay thousands of dollars to access the full report, but it'll give you a quick little like blurb about, a sneak peek at the market report, and we'll give you a little market size. So that's where we get a quick market size number from. But what I'm really getting at here is more using some of the like university databases that we have access to. So there's a lot in the business library. That information is a lot better quality than what you would get out of that short summary of a market research report. And yeah, you can be more confident that it's good information. So, yeah, maybe that's something we think about doing a workshop on in the future is some of these resources that are available in the business library and how to use them. I think that would be a good future topic. Yeah, thanks for your comment.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense.
Okay, and then for those of you who maybe some of those approaches seemed a little daunting, maybe they're not quite accessible yet. There is some structured programming available that can help. So UIRF has a technology analyst program for grad students and postdocs, and a few of you attending have already participated in this program. So if you're a faculty member, if you have a grad student or a postdoc who's interested in, innovation, this would be a really great program for them to get involved in. It's a very flexible program, 6 to 10 months long. The expectation is about 1 to 2 hours of work a week. So it's not too time intensive. And it's for a graduate student or a postdoc to work on a technology that they're working on and work one-on-one with a licensing associate through our whole internal evaluation process, as well as marketing and then IP strategy. So that's one way to kind of start thinking about some of these things. You do have to have a disclosure to be eligible for the program, but it can be a very like early phase project to participate. Another program is the JPEG NSF I-Core program. This is another good one if you're at a really early project stage. You'll do some customer discovery, so getting at the voice of the customer. So they'll, teach you how to do this. I think there's like a series of workshops that you'll participate in, and then you'll work on the customer discovery process. And then the last one is the Nucleate Activator program. So I would say this one is probably not as appropriate for the early stage projects. It's more of like an advanced stage. It would be more relevant to people who have disclosed already and we've protected the IP, because it's not um, like a confidential program. You submit your idea. It's more about venture building, like venture creation. You can sign up with your innovation, and then like a team will be built around the innovation. Again, there's a lot of like a series of workshops where you'll learn about market analysis and, product development and things like that. And then you'll get to network with a bunch of industry professionals and venture groups. And it culminates in a pitch where you can win some funding. So again, this one is more for later stage projects once you've already talked to our office. But feel free to reach out at any point if you're interested in any of these programs, and we're happy to talk with you more about which one might be a good fit for you. Okay, and then I have this optional assignment if anyone is interested that you can do between this workshop and next week's workshop. Since we're going to be focusing on communicating your research to industry, I thought it'd be a helpful exercise to think about, describing what you're working on in a way that would appeal to an industry audience. Think about, something pretty high level that's mentions the problem and the solution with 1 to 2 sentences max. And then next week, when we talk about how to communicate your research to industry, you can kind of see how well you did and if you need to reframe your description at all. So that's your optional homework assignment. And then I just wanted to bring this up as a reminder. We've talked about understanding industry needs today. I hope that you'll join us for the remaining sessions of the workshop series, where we'll build on this some more. And with that, I'm happy to take any other questions, comments. If you have any, feel free to unmute or put them in the chat. Oops. All right. Well, if there's no questions, then I think we can end there. And I hope that we see you all next week.
Thank you, Abby.
Thank you all.
Great.
Thank you.